Hello everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of Don John's Ducats by Roger Pilkington. When last we left our four heroes, they were moving towards the city of Dinant, where Michael, the youngest of the group, was hoping to receive a letter that would enlighten him as to the mystery of the disappearance of Don John's ducats. Well, he received the letter, as well as some information from the local vicar, who he had written to about Ensign Whittingham, the man suspected of stealing the ducats. But, unfortunately, it did not seem to lead him any closer to the current location of the treasure. And so he has been disappointed, but I suspect that his spirits will soon be raised, because when they were in the post office, he and his friend Carol met the post office worker, who explained to them that there was a wonderful adventure opportunity nearby, and since they are staying in the area for the day, it seems the perfect diversion. Let us continue, then, with Chapter 4, Under the Castle. Jill had just finished laying the breakfast when Carol jumped down from the quay and landed with a thump on the catwalk. Peter, who was examining the fuel tank, looked up and waved to her. He closed the cover and walked round to follow her down the companionway. Michael stood up, brush and dustpan in hand, and looked at her hopefully. "It's all fixed," she said. "What is?" Peter asked. "Never mind what. Anyway, I've already told you it's the less, and I'm not going to tell you any more. Besides, this is no time to stand here talking. We've just time to snatch a quick breakfast if we hurry, and at 5 to 10 I want everybody on the quayside. Our train leaves at 5 past from the other side of the bridge." "Train?" said Jill. "Yes, or puff-puff if you prefer," said Michael. "Hooray, I think this is going to be super." Jill made the tea, and they sat round the table, eating quickly. "No time to lose," Carol said, looking at her watch. "We can wash up later. We must be off in 5 minutes. "Are we to look specially tidy?" Jill asked. "No," said Carol. "Shorts and deck shoes will be worn by all. If you wear anything else, you may regret it." "It sounds as if we're going to walk quite a way," Peter said. Michael giggled. "If you call the station quite a way." Carol stood up. "Come on, 4 minutes to go. I'm sorry you've had to skimp on the breakfast." "I'll take a packet of biscuits and some chocolate out of the stores," said Jill. "Then nobody will feel starved." Shortly after 10 o'clock, the crew, somewhat out of breath, were hurrying up the steps to the platform just as the train drew in. Peter read the destination plate hanging on the side of one of the coaches. "Hoyet," he said. "And where is Hoyet?" "Never mind," said Carol. "In you get." The train was a local one, and it puffed along the bank of the river for a mile or two before swinging on to a long bridge of girders and clanking to a halt in the station of Anserem. It waited there only a moment, then panted away again, climbing rather more steeply along the contours of a deep and winding forest valley, and plunging into short tunnels which cut off the sharper bends. It was a wild and lonely countryside, and through the trees they occasionally caught a glimpse of a narrow, twisting river in a rocky gorge below. "That looks a pretty river," Jill said. "What a pity it isn't navigable." Carol smiled. "It might be. You never can tell," she said. "You can," Peter said. "It's too small, and you can see lots of rocks in it. I doubt if one could get up it even in the dinghy, particularly with that current. It's running at quite a few knots in places." Creeping round the rocky bluffs and diving in and out of the forest, the train pursued its way up the valley of the Less, until at last it emerged from the trees at a little hamlet. "This is it," said Michael, as the name came onto view on the end of the station building. "Hoyet, come on, everybody." "Won't you tell us what we're going to see?" said Jill, as she climbed down to the platform. "I've told you," said Carol. "It's the Less, and we have a hard day's work in front of us." "It will be a nice change from being on the water," Michael said innocently. "I expect the time will pass very rapidly. Don't you, Carol?" "I hope so," she said. "That seems to be the current way things happen around here." She handed the tickets to the inspector at the gate. "Don't you want to keep them for the return?" Peter asked. "They're singles," Carol replied. "You mean we're going to walk back? Heavens, it must be 15 miles at least." "You can walk if you like," Michael said. "Personally, I hope to make the journey under the force of gravity." Peter was still puzzling over this strange reply when they passed out of the station, and a bronzed lad in a check shirt and a jaunty nautical cap stepped forward. "Pour la laisse?" he asked, touching his cap. "Oui," said Carol. She produced a receipt slip and handed it to him. "C'est bon." He tore a corner off the receipt, handed it back to her, and then pointed along the road. Across the railway and down to the bridge they were to go, he explained. There everything would be ready for them. Carol hurried on ahead to the corner of the bridge, where a path led down to the water's edge. There, against a little landing stage, was moored an assemblage of small canvas craft with wooden bottoms. "Canoes!" Peter exclaimed. "Yes," said Carol triumphantly. "Kayaks. I've booked a couple of two-seaters. Now, who can guess what the Less is? The kayaks are floating on it. And that was the Less we came up in the train." "It's the river!" Peter exclaimed. Carol patted him on the back. "Brilliant," she said. "I'm glad you didn't guess earlier, or you might have thought it sounded dull." Jill looked at the shallow stream, flowing swiftly under the arch of the little bridge. "Dull? This ought to be great fun," she said. "I've never been in a kayak." "None of us have," Peter said, "unless Carol has, out in New Zealand." "I haven't," said Carol. "But it can't be all that difficult, especially with the current behind us." "What about coming back?" Jill said. "I should think that might be a bit harder." "We don't come back. We dump the canoes at the end, and they bring them back on a lorry up to the top again. We go down all the way, almost to Dinant." "Dinant!" Jill exclaimed. "That's miles." "I know." "How shall we split up?" asked Peter. "If there are no experts, we can go as we like." "I don't mind at all," Carol said. "Let's toss for it, and halfway down we can change over if we want to." She pulled out a 5-franc piece. It's not exactly heads and tails, but it will do. Guess the date, and the nearest can come with me." 1951, said Peter. "It might be an old one," Michael said. "I'll have 45. 60, Jill called. Carol looked at the coin. 60 it is, so it's you and me. The lad in the peaked cap came hurrying down from the station, and he untied 2 of the kayaks, and put a cushion and a couple of backrests in each. He held them steady while the pairs embarked, and then handed each of them a double-ended paddle. "I hope you know what to do," said Jill. "Paddle," said Michael. "Left, right, left, right. It's like rowing, only back to front and each side in turn." Carol took up her paddle. "We'll lead the way. Are you ready? Then we're off." She let go of the edge of the landing stage and pushed the canoe out sideways into the stream. The craft tipped and rocked, and Jill, who was sitting in the front seat, took a couple of gentle strokes with her double-ended paddle to carry them into the centre of the bridge arch, where at once the current caught them and swept them smoothly onwards between the banks. Carol dipped one blade of her own paddle over the port side to straighten the kayak, and then she too began to swing, left, right, left, right. "Your stroke," she said. "You set the pace, and I'll follow. Otherwise we'll probably hit each other's blades." Only a few yards behind them, the second canoe was now gliding downstream, with Michael as the lighter of the pair in the forward seat. He was already paddling hard in an effort to overtake the girls, but Carol looked over her shoulder and put more power into her strokes. "I think we're being followed," she said. "Don't let these pirates catch us." "They won't," said Jill. "Or if they do, we can always sink them." She swung her paddle faster and pulled strongly on the water. "It's amazing what a speed you can go at," she said. "We must be doing about 8 knots at least." "Over to the right a bit, on the bend," whispered Carol. "Look, you can see how fast it runs by the bank there." She gave an extra stroke on her left to carry the canoe over towards the swift current close against the bushes, and at once the stream swept them close in against the roots of the trees, where the water surging against the bank had washed the clay and gravel away to undercut the edge. "Duck!" cried Jill, bending forward with her head almost between her knees as they ran underneath an overhanging bush. "Keep the bow out," Carol said. "Quick, paddle right or push." But the tangle of branches overhead made it impossible for either of them to raise their paddles, and when the kayak shot out at the other side, the current was pressing on the inside of the stern, turning the canoe crosswise. Jill tried to give a strong push on her right, but the water was so shallow that the blade was hardly covered, and with a crackle and thump, the kayak plunged its nose into a patch of alder scrub. "Hooray!" shouted Michael exultantly, as he swept past in midstream with Peter. "Don't spoil the scenery," laughed Peter. "You're not supposed to knock down the trees. I think they're protected by the law." Carol picked up her blade and smacked obliquely at the water, splashing him down the back. "Come on, Jill," she said. "After them for all we're worth." Jill was laughing so hard that she seemed unable to paddle at all, but at last they managed to back out into the stream to take up the chase. Right, left, right, left. They were soon sweeping along in fine style. Peter looked round and grinned. "Come on," he called. "I thought you said you were going to lead the way." He pulled hard with the right blade to keep clear of a fallen tree trunk lying near the edge, then took up once more in the rhythm set by Michael. "We're doing fine," he whispered. Keep in the middle, then we shall be clear of everything." He had only taken a couple more strokes when, with a jerk, the bow tilted so suddenly that a slop of water came over the side just where he was sitting. "She's on a shoal," said Michael. "I'll jump out and lighten the bows." He hopped quickly into the water and began to shove at the bow while Peter back-paddled. The current swung the canoe sideways, and as the other kayak came swiftly past them, Carol leaned out and pulled Peter's stern with such a jerk that she dragged it away from Michael, who was left standing in the shallows. "Playing Robinson Crusoe?" she taunted. Michael rushed forward to grab the canoe, up to his waist in the water. "Just you wait," he called. "No thanks," shouted Carol. "I don't think we'll bother." And she and Jill paddled away downstream. "Well done," said Jill. "That should settle them for a while." They were sweeping round a sharp bend now, and a little way ahead the river split into two channels round a long shoal dotted with scrub willow and patches of reeds with knobbly brown seed heads. "Which side do we go?" Jill asked. "Either, I should think," Carol said. "Let's try the left. I don't expect it makes any difference." But turning a gentle curve to the right, the channel they had chosen grew somewhat shallower and ran into a fleet passage where the water bubbled noisily over the shingle on the bottom. Once or twice the canoe grated and bumped, then it ground to a stop. "Ought we not jump?" Jill said. "We can float her over or drag her. It's deep a few yards farther on." They climbed out quickly into the shallow water, which came only to their ankles, and shoving and heaving, they moved the craft, rumbling over the loose stones. Michael and Peter came gliding past on the other side of the long shoal, bobbing gaily on the current. "Feeling seasick, so you had to get out and walk?" Peter taunted. "See you later, if we're lucky." Jill picked up a hefty stone from the water and flung it into the stream close beside the other boat, drenching them with spray. "Good shot," said Carol. "Come on, we're nearly clear." And so throughout the morning the voyage continued, with one boat or the other running on the stones or into the bank, or being swept sideways on the sharp bends. Sometimes the stream flowed deep and still beneath high cliffs on either side. At others there were swift, shallow sections, where the canoes heaved and tossed happily on the rapids. Time and time again the two crews passed each other, and if one of them went hard aground on a smooth rock, or became entangled in the thick weed which grew in some of the more open patches, the other certainly did nothing to help. All four were soaked from head to foot, partly from the deliberate splashing of their opponents, but with the hot summer sunshine beating down upon them, and with the exertion of paddling, this just kept them pleasantly cool. As the morning wore on, their paddles began to strike more slowly. It was certainly a grand sport, but it was hard work, too. So at length the two canoes drew level and paddled idly down the river, without a house or a village in sight. In fact, the Less seemed to flow through nowhere, and there was never so much as a track along either bank. Right from the edge of the water, the mixed forest of oak and birch and pine rose steeply to the hilltops above, and beneath the trees the undergrowth was so thick that it would have been almost impossible to struggle through it. Once they heard a crashing as something scurried away in the thicket, and Michael was sure that it must have been a wild boar, but nobody managed to catch a glimpse of the creature. Then, a little farther down the stream, Jill was certain she saw a deer flash across a glade where the trees were rather more open. "It might have been," Peter agreed. These forests must be full of game of all sorts."
"Look!" cried Michael, staring into the water where it swept past some boulders. "That must be a trout. There, and another."
"Pity you haven't got a line," Carol said. "We could do with a few for supper."
"A spear would be the thing here," he said. "Gosh, there's a real beauty. But they shoot off pretty quickly when they see us."
Jill looked over the side to watch the darting forms of the fish, and then she leaned back contentedly in her seat.
"Never mind the trout," she said. "The whole place is absolutely wonderful. I could paddle for days in this great forest. It seems to go on forever."
"It's quite a jungle," said Michael.
"There's not a house or a person or anything. We might be 1,000 miles up the Amazon, or in darkest Africa. I should imagine some of the African rivers are very much like this."
"Except there are no crocodiles here," said Carol.
"Nor hippos. I wouldn't care to meet a hippo in a kayak."
"I didn't know that hippos went about in kayaks," said Peter.
"Didn't you?" Michael laughed. "There are 2 in this one alongside us." "How rude," said Carol.
She lifted her dripping blade and stretched it out over his head so that the water ran down his neck. "And don't forget that we've got the chocolate and biscuits on board, and you won't get any if you're not careful."
"I had forgotten," said Jill. "Let's all stop and have some. It must be Elevence's time or long past."
She looked at her watch.
"It's after 12:30 already."
"We don't need to stop," Carol said. "We're drifting along very nicely." She felt behind her seat, brought out her bucket bag, and divided the block of chocolate and the biscuits into 2 shares. "Here you are, Peter. And don't ask for any more, because there isn't any." Paddling or drifting, they passed happily on down the less, with the seemingly endless forest, broken only by occasional bluffs of stone. There were ducks about, and dippers flitting with their curious, hesitating flight from stone to stone, or standing to bob at the knees with their feet just in the water. Pied wagtails seemed the commonest of the birds along the stream, but plenty of others could be picked out by their sounds. From up above came the cawing of rooks, and occasionally the harsh call of a jay broke the silence of the forest above the banks, while in the undergrowth the warblers sang gaily, and the buntings among the reeds chattered continuously, but not very musically.
"They sound like a lot of sewing machines," said Jill. "I wonder why they can't sing a bit better." "I expect they just like to be different," Michael said. "It wouldn't be so nice if everything warbled away like nightingales."
It was already well past lunchtime when they came to a railway bridge, almost the first sign of civilization they had seen during the whole of the trip down the stream. A short way beyond it, there was a rough landing stage, and in a meadow beyond the bank stood a little house built of rough-hewn, dark-brown timber. A notice board at the edge of the meadow declared it to be a restaurant, and the crews decided to draw in to the side. "I could do with some lunch," Peter said. "The chocolate and biscuits were fine, but if we're going on like this all day, we had better take the chance while it's here." Pulling their boats to the bank, they tied the painters to a bush and scrambled ashore. "We aren't particularly tidy," Carol said.
"Never mind," Jill said. "We can sit outside. I'll go in and see what we can get to eat."
And while the others stretched out on the benches in the open, she ordered a lunch of sandwiches and lemonade. "How far have we come?" Peter asked as she joined them. "It seems miles already."
8 or 10, I should think," said Jill. "It's rather hard to tell with the stream winding about like that." I think we must be about halfway, Michael said. I remember that railway bridge from the train, and if it's halfway, we still have another 3 hours to go. I wish it were more. It's a super trip. Hear, hear, said Jill, and I think we should thank Carol for the idea. It wasn't mine, Carol said. It was the man in the post office who suggested it. He said we should never, never forget it. I think he was right, said Peter. It's the best outing we've had on any of our voyages on the Dabchick. Hear, hear, said Michael, and as a matter of fact, we would never have heard about it if it weren't for Ensign Whittingham. If Monsieur Blanchard hadn't told us the tale, I wouldn't have gone to the museum at Namur and seen the picture of his tombstone, and I wouldn't have written the letter asking for a reply to be sent to the post office. And if I hadn't done that, we would never have heard of the less, should we? So you see, something came of it after all. Perhaps that will teach you not to be so snooty next time. We weren't being snooty, Jill said. Well, we can at least thank the gallant ensign for putting us on to this, said Carol. Gallant? I bet he was a crook, said Michael. That is a mystery which will never be solved, said Carol. You will never, never forget the less. Oui, oui, monsieur. Et vous will never, never know the truth about what happened to Don John's gold after Waterloo. That reminds me, Jill said. Do you know the story about Mrs. Jones and her grandfather who was at the Battle of Waterloo? No, said Carol. I do, said Michael. So do I, said Peter. It's Jill's favourite story. Please, tell me just the same, said Carol. So Jill began her tale. It was at a party, she said. You know, one of those parties where everybody likes to be rather superior and one up on everyone else. And there was a Mrs. Brown there who was saying what wonderful things her uncle or somebody had done, and Mrs. Jones looked at her down her nose and said, My great-grandfather, I may tell you, was killed at Waterloo. So Mrs. Brown looked sympathetic and felt she ought to say something, and she said, Oh, how dreadful. Which platform? Silly woman, said Michael, laughing. Carol pretended to look very dense. I think I see it, she said slowly. Yes, of course. There wouldn't have been any trains in her great-grandfather's day. Is that it? That's not the end of the story, you donkey, said Jill. Mrs. Brown was heard by all the people standing around, one of whom was Mrs. Smith. And Mrs. Smith hurried over to her husband and said to him, Honestly, dear, that Mrs. Brown says the stupidest things. Mrs. Jones was telling her that her great-grandfather was killed at Waterloo. And do you know what she said? You would never guess. She asked which platform. Did you ever hear anything so daft? Quite absurd, said her husband, as though it mattered which platform anyway. Carol laughed, and so did the others, even though they had heard her tell the story before. Thank you all for being such a wonderful, wonderful audience, said Jill. Just then, a girl wearing a striped apron came out of the house, carrying a tray. Interval for refreshments, said Peter. Sit up, everybody. Here it comes. The girl put down the tray on a wooden table. You like the less? Oui, she said with a smile. Oui, said Peter. C'est très joli. But the water is low, said the girl, very low. In the spring, when the water comes down from the snow in the hills, then whoosh, then it is good in a canoe. It's good enough now, Michael said, but it must be a fine sight when it's rushing."
The girl smiled.
"Perhaps you will come back in the spring."
She took the money which Jill held out and felt in her apron pocket for the change. "Perhaps," said Peter. "Where is the next place on the river?" Carol asked.
"There is no place till Anserem, where the Lys and the Meuse join," the girl replied. "Before that, there is only the Chateau de Walsin, high in the air."
She waved her hand towards the sky. "Thank you," said Carol.
"C'est rien. Au revoir, messieurs, mesdames," she said in a sing-song voice. "Bon voyage."
After all the hard work of the morning, the lunch was certainly welcome. It was delicious, too, for the sandwiches were made of rich country bread with a blackish crust, and filled with thick slices of excellent smoked ham. Quite kippery, as Michael remarked. As soon as they had finished, they strolled back to the river bank, and there it was decided to change the crews for the second half of the voyage. Carol and Michael took one canoe, and Jill and Peter the other, and the positions were changed too, so that Michael and Jill took the stern seats, and the steersmen of the morning took up their stations forward. Jill untied the painters and jumped aboard. "No racing," said Carol. "It's so lovely down this gorge that I could stay here for days. Besides, I feel rather sleepy, don't you?" "Too much jambon," said Jill. "Still, we're not in any hurry, so we can paddle down as gently as we like." Carol was not the only one to feel drowsy. Perhaps the brightness of the light on the water had something to do with it, and the quiet gliding as they floated effortlessly through reach after reach of the scent-laden woods. There was no doubt, too, that they had worked hard for most of the morning, and certainly the bread and ham was a good square meal. Everything seemed to make it more and more difficult to keep wide awake, and before they had gone very much farther, Peter began to nod. He rubbed his eyes and sat back in his seat. "It makes one quite dozy," he said. Jill laughed. "You can't go to sleep paddling," she said. "No, but it's very pleasant, just drifting down like this. And we've all the time in the world. We haven't got to catch a train." "I can hardly keep my eyes open," said Carol drowsily from the canoe alongside. She was trailing her fingers in the water, leaving Michael to give an occasional push with the paddle. "It's quite heavy and steamy down in the bottom of the gorge." "Fancy coming all the way out here just to doze," said Michael. "That's the best thing about holidays," Carol said. "There's no hurry, and we can do whatever we like. She hasn't been on holidays with my family. There is way too much scheduled at all times." Carol leaned back and closed her eyes. "I like it when I don't have to be anywhere particular at some definite time." "If you're all half asleep, we can have a competition," Michael suggested. "We'll lie back in the kayaks and drift, and we can see who can get the farthest without being stranded. We can all close our eyes, and the first boat to be stopped has to shout." "Fine," said Peter. He took out the back of his seat and lay down in the sunshine. "We'll beat you." "No cheating," murmured Carol as she wriggled down into the bottom. "No looking, and no pushing off." "We'll promise," said Jill. "Everybody ready? Right. Paddles out of the water, and off we go." She too lay back to let the sun beat down on her face. Without a sound, the two craft drifted on their way, sometimes pointing downstream, sometimes moving stern first or broadside to the flow, according to the way the eddies and swirlings of the water pushed and pulled at them. Along this stretch of the river there were fewer shoals, but now and again a gentle bump or a scraping on the wooden bottom would tell that they were running over a shallow patch of shingle. Peter's boat ran on a rock at the bow, but the game was still not lost, for the stream swivelled the canoe slowly round to float it on its way once more. "Lovely," murmured Peter. "Peace. Perfect peace." And a moment later he was fast asleep. Jill lay with her eyes closed, enjoying the brilliance of the hot sun as it made orange and purple patterns inside her eyelids, forms which changed their colour and shape as a branch or a tall cliff top cut off the light. Then the canoe would glide out into the sun again, and once more the deeper colours flashed back to vivid oranges and reds and strange metallic tints which she had never seen anywhere but in her own closed eyes. She trailed one hand over the side of the canoe, and then lifted it out of the water to let the drips fall on her forehead and cheeks. Far overhead, Jill heard the scream of a strange bird, high in the sky. It would not be cheating to look at it, she thought, provided she did not look at the stream or try to steer, and so she rolled her palms like a telescope, and put them one above the other over her right eye, which she then cautiously opened. Through the tunnel of her hands she could see only the intense blue of the sky, and one tiny patch of summer cloud. But sweeping her home-made blinkers from side to side, she at last made out the tiny specks of two birds of prey, soaring and gliding at a great height. Buzzards, she thought they must be, or perhaps some hawk or eagle of the Ardennes that she did not know. They were so far away that only their wheeling motion told her that they were at least some kind of hawk. "I wonder what we look like from up there," she said to herself. "Pretty small, no doubt." She kept her gaze following the pair of hawks. There have probably been hawks circling here for centuries, not caring a jot what people are doing down below. They were circling when this was Roman Gaul, when Caesar's legions were coming and going on the Meuse. They were still there when Don John was ruler for Philip of Spain. Perhaps the ancestors of this very same pair wheeled high overhead when Margaret of Navarre came to Namur, or soared far up in the sky above the hovel where Don John himself died alone and unattended. And the same kind of hawk, with such a wonderful bird's-eye view of the world below, could have seen where Ensign Whittingham fled, and what he did, if indeed he had taken the gold. Except, of course, that it was in the night, a time for owls rather than hawks. But hawks are robbers too, she thought. Even if they could have told, they wouldn't have done so. And then, realizing the strange thing she was thinking, she put down her hands, closed her eyes, and smiled. "You're sleepy,"
she said to herself. "You're just thinking nonsense." She yawned in the still heat of the afternoon. A loud cry, sharp and urgent, made her sit bolt upright, tingling with the sudden change from drowsiness to being fully alert. The sound broke into Peter's sleep too, and he raised himself on his elbow. "Look!" she gasped. "Quick!" At the end of the short reach ahead of them, and a mere 60 or 70 yards away, the Lys flowed against a sheer cliff of whitish rock, which actually overhung the water below. It was far above this cliff that the hawks were slowly circling on the upward air current, and right on the very edge of the rock was perched a castle with round towers and steep turret roofs. But it was not from these that the cry had come. Down at the water's edge, at the foot of the precipice below the castle, a narrow, gaping hole stood like a blot on the smooth surface of the rock. From its mouth the stern of the other kayak still protruded, and as Peter stared in its direction he heard the cry again. "Help!" Michael's arms were grabbing and clawing at the smooth edge of the opening. "Help!" A third time the cry came, following quickly on the others. Then the tail of the kayak raised itself a little and disappeared. Jill seized her paddle. "Quick!" she almost screamed, and as Peter snatched his own and knelt in the front of the canoe to wield it with all his might, she swept her blades alternately through the water for all she was worth. The canoe bore down swiftly upon the rock face beneath the castle. The main bulk of the water swept against the cliff and ran off to the left towards the top of a shallow weir. But a lesser torrent ran straight into the darkness of the hole. Peter quickly saw the cavity that was only a little broader than the kayak, and he gave a sharp order. "Swing her broadside, then we can't be drawn into the hole." Provided for us here is a beautiful drawing, I don't know how well you can see it, of the castle, with the two hawks circling overhead, serene in the face of the danger that has befallen Carol and Michael. Peter gave a powerful stroke on the right. "Backwater, left hand," he said urgently. Jill obeyed instantly, and the canoe swung parallel to the rock face and surged against it with a jolt as the current flowed into the hole, drew it across the mouth. Peter scrambled to his knees and put his head up to the opening. "Are you there?" he yelled desperately. In answer there came faintly above the roaring of the water a voice repeating, "There, there." "Echo," he muttered without glancing towards Jill, who was holding the boat against the rock. He put his hands to his mouth. "Michael! Carol!" he shouted at the top of his voice. Again the echo came from within the hill. "Carol! Carol!" It almost seemed as though it were mocking him. Jill sat absolutely still, her deep eyes staring blankly into the cavity. Peter turned his head. "There's such a roaring. I can't hear if anyone answers," he said. Jill scrambled forward, and the canoe lurched. Peter held it steady with one hand and placed his other in the belt of her shorts as she peered into the blackness of the hole. A draught of cool air came from inside the cliff, bearing the smell of damp. "Michael!" she almost screamed, then turned her head sideways to listen.
Amid the roaring of the water she heard her own voice ringing throughout the vault within. "My girl, my girl, my girl." And then, very, very faintly, the two syllables, "Peter." It was something between a sob and a gasp of relief which Jill uttered as she picked up the sound. Peter had evidently heard it too, for she felt his hand tighten on her belt. Carefully he pulled her back into the well of the canoe and put his hand on her arm. Jill looked at him and wiped her forehead on the back of her hand. "That was Carol," she said. "Thank goodness she's—" "Shh!" Peter held up his hand. The call came again, very faintly, but this time it was on 2 notes together. "They're both all right," Jill cried with relief. "They're there, and it's up to us to get them out." Peter nodded. But how? He glanced at the current streaming through the hole to disappear in the shadow beyond. "I'm not sure that it's going to be so easy." "We must, somehow." "Yes," he said, "we must, and quickly, too." He leaned over so far into the hole that Jill had to move across to the other side to prevent the kayak from upsetting. He took a deep breath. "Are you safe?" he bawled into the darkness. This time it was Michael's voice that answered, coming syllable by syllable through the gurgling of the chasm. "We are on land." "He says they're on land," said Peter over his shoulder. He turned back to the hole once more. "We will get help. We will get help. You understand?" His words rang out clearly into the void in front of him. "Yes," came the answer in both voices. Peter sat back into the kayak and seized his paddle. "Shove her straight out as hard as you can, then paddle." "Right," said Jill, and with all her strength she pushed the kayak out into the river where it swirled below the castle cliff. Quite an abrupt change of tone there, but a dramatic event that I quite enjoyed. I'm glad to see that both Michael and Carol seem to be safe, and that they seem to be on land, somewhere in the cave beneath the castle. I hope they're all right, and I guess we'll have to find out what happens to them next time on Soft Stories. Thank you so much for joining me, and until we meet again, goodbye.